Hey guys, we're back. This time we're going to be taking a look at another one of the fan-made expansions for Star Trek Ascendancy. And this one is kind of near and dear to my heart because I did a lot of work on it. It started off with a guy named Archmage64 posted up his thoughts for a Dominion faction for Ascendancy. And there was a lot of discussion between different people on the forums, and then the whole thing kind of died off. So I took what kind of culminated in everybody's consensus of what the things should be. We made it up ourselves. We did a bunch of play testing, and this is the current version of how everything looks to be turning out. It doesn't seem like it's going to go a lot farther than this. I don't think much is going to change from this version, and that's why I'm going ahead to make the video. Some of the components might change, like the trade agreements and the fleets. I forgot to redo the font. I went through and redid the font in a lighter color so it's actually more readable. Those weren't too bad, so I didn't think about it at the time, but now everything else has this light green font and they're still in purplish blue, so it doesn't match. So I'm going to go through and change those, but as far as actually changing the faction, I don't see too terribly much being altered from the way it is now. So I thought it was alright to go ahead and make the video. And I already mentioned Archmage64 is the one who originally came up with the idea, and then we tweaked it from there. And then Bob Pony made these awesome models, and he went above and beyond and actually made fighter models for the for your normal ships based on the advanced Beetle ship from Star Trek Online. And then there's the fleet models, which are actually battle cruisers, and then all the way up to the what amounts to our stations are the actual battleships, and even made custom nodes for the planet, all of which are cool. And as I said, my view on this one might be a little biased because I've done a lot of work testing and tweaking things to get it to where it is. So take it with a grain of salt, read everything through for yourself, and decide if it's something you'd be interested in. Don't go off just what I say, because as I said, I might be a little biased on this one. Try not to be, but I am. These ones are a little difficult to read on the camera because the font is kind of small on them, but the files for this on BGG do come with a text file so you can read the stuff. And first thing we have here is Vorta Diplomacy. And this was one that kind of went around a lot, went through a lot of iterations and changes over the time. First off is that the Dominion must always attempt hegemony before they can invade a system. If the hegemony attempt fails, they must immediately invade the system without spending a command token, and they get a +1 to their hegemony roll if they have more ships in the system than there are nodes. There's a lot of stuff there to unpack, but basically, you have to attempt to peacefully take over a system before you can invade it. If that fails, you have to invade. So you have to keep in mind you need enough ships in orbit to be able to do the invasion, even if the off chance that the peaceful attempt fails. On the other side, and this one went through quite a few iterations as well, Ketracel White. In the recharge phase, any ship that is not in a system you control, directly connected to a system that you control, or in a system with a battleship, or in a system directly connected to a battleship that you control, you have to roll in a level 4 hazard. And if you fail, obviously the ships are destroyed. It's basically you're cutting off your fighters from their source of Ketracel White, and they basically destroy themselves. Huge detriment, meaning that you have to keep your forces grouped together. You have to spread out in slow increments. Your battleships become a huge strategic point, both for you because of how powerful they are, and we'll get to that in a minute, but for your opponents because if they knock those out, it knocks out your mobile source of Ketracel, and you revert back to systems and whatnot. So that if you have an attack fleet that moves off hoping to colonize a planet, they get severed off from the rest. The ships will eventually self-destruct unless you can get that supply chain reconnected. So it makes your opponents taking out your battleships a very strategic target. So keep that in mind. And we'll get into more on the battleships when we get to those. For our starting advancement here, This is another one that people talk about being extremely powerful, but at the same time, the Ferengi have the same thing they can research. We toned it down a lot from what it originally was, but basically, if you can build 3 ships for the price of 2, so it allows you to buy 2 get 1 free. Basically, I think that's actually the name of the Ferengi card, but it allows you to build up your ships very quickly, which was one of the things the Dominion was good at. They had a lot of troops, a lot of numbers, and that's one of their main advantages. So under our fleets here, our first fleet is the Founder's Escort. This is a 6-ship fleet, and all the ships in the fleet add +1 to their shields. Makes them a little more defensive. They can go out. Basically, that's a fleet that you're going to be taking out trying to colonize with. That's the one you're going to be using for your border diplomacy, and if you fail, you have a 6-ship fleet with boosted up shields to do the invasion to try to take the planet. The next one is the Dominion Assault Force. This one is a hit or miss with a lot of people. Early game, it's very powerful. Late game, not so much. And it's a 4-ship fleet, and all the ships in there get +1 to their weapons. So that makes your ships a little bit more offensive, and early on. Later on, you're going to probably rely on the flip sides, and we'll get to that in a second, and you'll see what the perk of that is. And our last one is the Dominion Envoy, and all ships in that fleet get a +1 to their hegemony attempts. It's only a 4-ship fleet, but again, it plays off our Vorta diplomacy thing. They get +1 for the fleet. You get +1 if you have more ships than there are nodes. 4 is the max nodes you can have in a system, so if you're going for something that's not completely developed yet, that gives you a bonus there as well. They kind of stack. Interesting fleet. I would love it to be more ships, but then it becomes a little too powerful, so it's pretty balanced where it is. Most of the time, though, later in the game, you're going to be using the other side of your fleets, which is a massive 12-ship fleet to just overwhelm your enemies. And again, as always with our custom factions here, I've got the escalation pack added in, which is the extra row and a half of ships there in the back and an extra 5 control nodes. Because of that, you can actually max out all 3 fleets of 12 and still have a couple ships left over. If you're playing with just the base faction, you only have 30 ships. You can't even max out all 3 of those fleets, so keep that in mind. And the last thing we have, and one of the more interesting things, is the battleships. And these models are really cool looking, and they have starbase bases because we weren't sure if we were going to use them like star bases or not, but I kind of like the way that they're functioning now, and I think that's the way they're going to stay. They basically function like an additional fleet, so it gives you an option to get up to 6 fleets technically. Now, because they function like our star bases, they do a lot of odds and end things. So first off, you're limited to 1 battleship per ascendancy level, just like you are star bases. For each battleship that you have in play, you get 1 extra command, just like star bases. Keep in mind, when you do build the battleship and you get that extra command, it does come into play exhausted, just like it does when you build a star base. Battleships can only be built on the Dominion homeworld, the Omarion Nebula, or on the world designated as their Alpha Quadrant homeworld by use of the Great Link token, which we'll get to when we do the advancements. So there are only 2 places that you can build them. So unlike a starbase where somebody can build it in any system they control, you're limited on where you can actually produce these. Now the major differences come into play on the fact that unlike starbases, battleships actually cost you 5 production to build, which is very steep. You could get roughly 7 ships built with that same amount of points for the Dominion. So you keep that in mind, there's a balance there. But they function, like I said, kind of like a fleet. They can move just like any of your fleets can. They can attack, they can defend. Anything a normal fleet can do, except they are not allowed to disband. They cannot colonize, because in those respects they're treated like a station. However, when attacking, the battleships actually get 5 dice. They count as 5 ships, basically, a fleet of 5. As they take damage, you put a counter next to them, or we use a die 6 of a different kind so they stand out. Put it next to it to keep track of damage. When they finally take 5 points of damage, they are destroyed. So unlike a normal starbase where you can switch control, these actually get destroyed. You can rebuild them, again up to the same limitations of your number of them equal to your ascendancy, but it's also going to cost you that production again to rebuild them later on, and you've got to rebuild them back at the home system. So there's limitations as far as that goes. It's one of the few starbase type things that can actually be destroyed as well. So as I was saying, each time you take a damage to your battleship, you put a counter next to it. For each counter next to it, it also loses a die in attack. So if a combat's still going, you have a second round, you take a hit, now you only have 4 attack. The next time you take another hit, now you only have 3 attack. If that gets reduced to 0, you've taken 5 hits and the battleship is destroyed. If a rival player destroys a battleship, they get a reward in salvage, basically. But currently we're looking at 2 production and 1 research for destroying a battleship. We've been toying around with different amounts, and that seems to be the most balanced. That's what the current build of the mod has it listed as. And it gives them an extra incentive to go after such a powerful unit. Usually one of these is escorted by a fleet or at least a handful of ships. So it's a really tough battle to win. If you can win, if you can blow up the battleship, then the attacking player would get the reward and make it worth their while. Not only are they robbing you of a command because you've lost your battleship, you also lose the command that it granted you. You're costing them production because they've got to rebuild a new one later on, but they're getting a reward out of it too, of the salvage that they claim. In a multi-ship battle, so if you have a fleet involved or other ships and a battleship, the battleship always takes hits last, so everything else would get wiped out before it. Makes them a little stronger and a little more durable, especially now since they're such a tempting target for giving that. Not only are you robbing a command from the Dominion, but you're also making them spend money to rebuild it, and you're getting a reward. Lots of bonuses both ways there, lots of hindrances, so makes them a little more durable, making them take the damage last. And of course, on the Dominion player's turn, they can spend production at any point except during combat to repair a battleship. 1 production per point to repair. So onto our advancements deck. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. And the first one, sadly, this one is hard to read because the text ended up being so small. Again, got to refer to that printed document if you can't read it. But this is one of the coolest, most unique ones in here, in that once per game, when this is in play, you can take this Great Link token, place it on one of your fleets. Doesn't matter what fleet it is, any one of your fleets. That fleet can go to an uncontrolled system. Disband, you have to suspend at least 3 of the ships that were in that original fleet. You can automatically colonize that planet by putting the Great Link token on it, and then putting one of your control nodes on the Great Link. That for the rest of the game will now count as a second homeworld for your faction. If somebody wants to eliminate you as a race, they need to take both of your homeworlds. You, however, to win, only need to control one of them. Keep that in mind. If the fleet carrying the Great Link token is destroyed, this goes back off to the side. This card actually gets reset. Once this has actually been completed and is on a planet, this is discarded and has no effect for the rest of the game other than your new homeworld planet. But it allows you to basically use this. You get to use this to completion once. If they keep blowing up the ship that's doing it, you can still retry. Dominion Tribute, during your recharge phase, you basically get a extra production or research. You get to pick which. Tachyon Sweep makes it so other players do not get first strike in space battles against you. Very nice against certain factions. Some basic ones in here. Hegemony Resistance. The Founder's Wise is a nice one. Allows you to exhaust this card to refresh a command or re-roll a die. So you can do this once per turn because you exhaust it and then it comes back the next turn. But maybe you rolled really poorly on something. Use it to re-roll. Or to get back that one extra command you need to make that final attack or something along those lines. Victory is Life is one of my favorites. After a successful space battle, you get to immediately build a ship for free in that system or space lane, wherever battle took place. And if there's a fleet that was part of that battle, the ship can actually join that fleet. So it's built right back into the fleet. Basically, you're scrounging parts to rebuild one of your ships that was disabled during the battle. But I like that one. Got our normal espionage type cards. Exhaust this to exhaust a command card. Jem'Hadar can get the, Jem'Hadar Shroud gives you first strike during planetary invasions. This one is super powerful. The energy dissipators. You roll a die before the start of a space battle. On a roll of a 1 or 2, the opponent's shields are nullified for the rest of this battle. And it's basically the Breen energy dissipator that the Dominion had access to. If anything changes, I might swap this card out, because now that there's a Breen faction, it doesn't feel right to have the Breen energy dissipator in the Dominion, but it's there because it was their weapon during the Dominion War. Fear of the Solids is an interesting one that allows you to, after a successful battle, you can spend 2 production to exhaust a trade agreement of the losing player. Can really be detrimental. You're spending 2, so unless you're disabling at least a 2 trade agreement, it's kind of offsetting. Good against like the Ferengi, or someone holding a Ferengi trade agreement, or even some of the player-made factions that have things other than production. The last one of real importance in here is, I think, the Dominion Non-Aggression Treaty. And this one costs you 3 cultures, so it's extremely expensive, and it's an exhaust, so you can only use it once per turn. But it allows you to choose one of your opponents, and they basically have to become friendly to you for 2 turns. They cannot attack you, you cannot attack them, then they have to exchange a trade agreement with you if they have one. Makes it really interesting, and those trade agreements can't be broke for the duration of it either, so kind of forces someone to like you temporarily. And another one of good note is the Founder's Will. Once per turn, the Dominion may razz one of its controlled systems. Basically, you wipe out all of the nodes on the planet. In exchange, all of those nodes generate 2 of whatever resource they normally would. Can be super powerful in the right situation, blowing up one of your own planets to basically double the resource generation for that turn. On the downside, it's a very short-term goal, because now your planet produces nothing next turn, and it costs you a lot to rebuild those nodes. Really useful in like dire situations, or if you just took over a planet that you don't expect to be keeping very long, you can take over the planet, razz it, and then just abandon it. Overall, I really like the way the Dominion have been turning out. Still think it may need 1 or 2 tweaks here or there, but nothing major, nothing that's going to change it from the way it looks and feels right now. They are a very powerful faction. They can build up massive amounts of ships very quickly. They effectively have 6 fleets if you combine their normal 3 fleets with their battleships, and that really makes them a powerhouse, which they should be. But at the same time, they're balanced enough due to other areas that it kind of evens out. If the player playing the Dominion spreads themselves out too thin and explores too far away, it's really easy to swoop in and take a system out from behind them, cutting off troops in the advance. And if you can completely cut them off from each other, then they start falling to the Ketracel White. They have to either retake planets or get a battleship out there. And you can really direct some of what they have to do based on your actions. So that kind of limits their power to some extent. They have to make sure that they're not overextending themselves and setting themselves up to be cut off on their supply lines. And that's a really nice balance to the power that they possess as a faction overall. As I said, I really enjoy playing them. I like the way that they turned out. They seem balanced enough where they are powerful at times, but I've seen them get their butt kicked at times as well. So I think there is balance there. Could use a few more tweaks here and there. I'd like to clarify some things and make it easier to explain without having to refer to the reference cards. But overall, it's perfectly playable the way it is, and we have a lot of fun with it. The one thing I might add to the faction in the future is another card, kind of like your command phase card here, that explains in detail all of the abilities of the battleships, how they build them, what they give you bonuses, what they give you as penalties, to make it easier, just a little reference card so all those rules are right together. Definitely want to add that to the file section here in the future. Overall, though, they are a fun faction to play. They are a very powerful faction in the right hands, especially if somebody can understand and use them to their utmost. Just like the Ferengi are extremely powerful, though, in the right player's hands. They have some checks and balances in there, and I think it's pretty close to being the final version of them, though. And like I said, that's why I decided to go ahead and do this. That, and I got all the cool models to show off, too, so I figured why not. Anyway, that's a look at the Dominion faction for Star Trek Ascendancy. I hope it gave you a nice overview of what our thinking was and most of the decisions we made for it. And hope it interests you guys enough to try it out for yourselves. Definitely leave me some feedback, and we're open to make changes if we need to. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.